ಶಬರಿ ಭಾಗ್ಯಮೆಲ್ತನಿನೇ ನಿಲ್ತುನು ಶಬರಿ ಭಾಗ್ಯಮೆಲ್ತನಿನೇ ನಿಲ್ತುನು ಶಬರಿ ಭಾಗ್ಯಮೆಲ್ತನಿನೇ ನಿಲ್ತುನು ಶಬರಿ ಭಾಗ್ಯಮೆಲ್ತನಿನೇ ನಿಲ್ತುನು ಶಬರಿ ಗಾಂತುಲ ಮರಕಾಂತಲು ಜಗರಿ ಶಬರಿ ಭಾಗ್ಯಮೆಲ್ತನಿನೇ ನಿಲ್ತುನು ಶಬರಿ ಕನುಲಾರ ಸೇವಿಲ್ಶಿ ಕನುಲಾರ ಸೇವಿಲ್ಶಿ ಕನುಲಾರ ಸೇವಿಲ್ಶಿ ಕಮ್ಮರಿ ಫಲಮೂಲನು ಸಗಿ ತನುಬುಲ ಕರೆ ಪಾರಯುಗಮುದಕು ರೋಕೀನ ಕುಲಪತಿ ಸಮುಗಂ ಪುನರಾವೃತ್ತಿರಹಿತ ಪದಗಿನ ಕುಲಪತಿ ಸಮುಗಂ ಪುನರಾವೃತ್ತಿರಹಿತ ಪದಮುನು ಕುಲ್ದಿನ ತ್ಯಾಗರಾಜಯೇ ಮುನು ಕುಲ್ದಿನ ತ್ಯಾಗರಾಜ ಮುನು ಕುಲ್ದಿನ ತ್ಯಾಗರಾಜ ಮುದುರಾಲಿ ಪುಣ್ಯಂ ಪುನ ಮುನು ಕುಲ್ದಿನ ತ್ಯಾಗರಾಜ ಮುದುರಾಲಿ ಪುಣ್ಯಂ ಪುನ ಎಲ್ತನಿನೇ ನಿಲ್ತುನು ಶಬರಿ ಭಾಗ್ಯಮೆಲ್ತನಿನೇ ನಿಲ್ತುನು ಶಬರಿ
A very good evening to all of you. Namaskaram. Actually, it is usual that we have a concert during the season, but this season being a 125th anniversary of Tata, so we said actually we will have a lecture. And before I actually talk, I mean, everybody here will know Sriram. It will be stupid on my part to try and introduce him. Instead, actually what I would like to do is, I've never done this before. In my own young days, actually I know this house when I was a very small boy. My father used to bring me here. And I never knew Tata. Only thing is, the man used to be in the front room. He was ailing at that time. But yet, I didn't know music, I didn't know him, I didn't know anything. But I used to see all big people coming there. I've seen M.S. Subbulakshmi. I've seen, of course, the Dasinam along with her. I've seen, Palghat T.K.V. Narayan Swami coming. I've seen Goenkaji. I've seen many people like that. And afterwards, my sister got married to this house, to my brother-in-law. So thereafter, actually, I started really knowing a little bit more. I started listening to music, his music. And then I started realizing what a great man he was. Full life of giving, whether it is within the family or outside, musicians or otherwise. An eclectic personality who had such a social connect with the Goenkas of the world at that time. And they used to, I remember receiving Narasimhan Mama and all coming here. They all used to pay cards. I can't even go there and see. So that was the time. So it's really wonderful for us to celebrate Sangeeta Kalanidhi, Sangeeta Kalanidhi, Musiri Subramaniayar's 125th anniversary here. And I have to tell here about Sriram. We go a long way, nearly 2 plus decades I would say, 25 years of association as a family. Him and Sharda, the silent force behind him. Everybody says he's a businessman and a historian. She's a business woman in her own right. So we have a fantastic relationship. I remember when Sriram started this Mylapore box, he was gracious enough to include us as one of the port of call. This is the first place, right? So he used to come here and bring the audience and then talk about the place and all that. From that onwards, a lot of things happened between his family and our family together. So this year, actually, it was casually, we were talking about the 125th year. And of course, Sriram is now really a celebrity, right? And I know I hear him at Madras Chamber, I hear him at so many other places, and he's hard to get. And we were not sure even we can ask him, right? But I know that he values the relationship as much as we do. So he came forward himself and said, Tyagu, what are you doing? 125th year. Should we really be talking about the great man? And I'll be glad to come and talk here. And thank you so much, Sriram. That is the greatness about Sriram as well. And it goes a long way as far as we are concerned. And without much ado, we all know Sriram. I don't want to take any more time. It's over to you, Sriram.
I think it's working, so it's not switched on rather. So I think this will do. I would just like to first of all thank Mr. Thyagarajan, Rajeshwari, and everybody else of the family for having given me this opportunity to come here today and pay my tribute to Sangeeta Kalanidhi Musiri Subramaniayar. 25 years ago, when I started writing on Carnatic music, that was the year when we first had a heritage walk. And then I remember with great reputation, I came and approached Mr. Thyagarajan wanting to know whether we could come to his house as one of the halts in the first ever walk that was done in 1999. And you see, because all Mylapore Mamas have a tendency to rebuff anybody who is relatively unknown. So I was fully confident that I would be rebuffed. That was the response that I was expecting. But I was very strangely and taken aback when he said, not only can you come in, we will put out all the artifacts of Musiri that are available with us. We used to have coffee here, and that became a standard spot. Every time we did the walk, for I think 2 or 3 years we did it, it was always a great location. And as VC said, we became very close friends. And when I wrote Carnatic Summer, that was in 2004, Mr. Thyagarajan was very much involved, particularly in the chapter on Musiri Subramaniayar. And without him, several personal traits of Musiri, several aspects of Musiri would not have come to light as far as I am concerned. Now, why do I say several traits of Musiri would not have come to light? Musiri as a personality in the world of music is not as popular as Ariyakudi or say Chembai or Maharajapuram Vishwanatha Iyer, each one of them known for various reasons to have remained in the forefront of the art. Ramanuja Iyengar not only because he had an extensively long career, starting from 1913, going all the way up to the year of his death in 1967. January 1967, he passed away, so 66 middle. He was performing until then, which was a very long career. And he was always acknowledged as the first force in the world of Carnatic music. Vishwanatha Iyer was known more for a colorful personality, his jokes, many of them unprintable, and his great sense of imagination with which he took to flights of fancy. Chembai, because of what Chembai was, that bold and strident music, straight speaking to the heart and so on. So these were the four great contemporaries, if you look at it, because people like Semangudi, GNB and others, they come later. Ramanuja Iyengar, 1890, Maharajapuram Vishwanatha Iyer, I think 1895, Chembai 1894 or so, and Musiri 1899. So these were the four great contemporaries. Musiri was definitely the youngest of that big four. And because his active performing career had got over a long while before that, he was known greatly as a teacher, as a personality in the world of music. Facts about Musiri Subramania Iyer were a little difficult to get as far as I was concerned, and that is why I considered myself very lucky to have got to know the family and to have got so much out of it in order to fill a full chapter on him when I wrote that book. And ever since then, I began to listen to a lot of Musiri. Mr. Thyagarajan gave me the first recordings that I listened to of the great man. Prior to that, strangely enough, I had only heard one or two very, very brief snatches, and I had read his obituary written in the Kalki magazine, which was so moving. And I had never heard him, and I heard these recordings, and even today, Pahimam Ratnachalanayaka, Nagumomu, these are all recordings that I keep going back to all the time and listening to them, because I have never come across such a style of rendition ever. This afternoon particularly, the late Keshav Desiraju is very actively in my mind, because I remember one of the last few conversations that I had with him, he called and he said, "This Musiri, what a nuanced artist. Where was he hiding all along in my life?" This is what he said. And he was addicted to listening to Musiri just before his sudden death. So, he had become a complete convert to, convert is a wrong word these days. Shall I say, he had become a great devotee of Musiri. And so that was the impact that Musiri Subramania Iyer had so many years afterwards. I also believe that Musiri's life has a lot of messages, particularly in today's world when Carnatic music, in my view, entirely my view, and need not be others, I believe that the art is in a great serious crisis. And it can take any turn, in my view, not because of the quality of performance, but the quality of support that it gets from people. And I believe that Musiri also came into this world at a time when there were great revolutions happening, but he made it to the very top. And let's not forget that Musiri Subramania Iyer was a completely self-made man. Completely self-made. There was no godfather, there was no great guru till pretty late. And despite all that, he made it very big. Maybe because of that he made it very big. Maybe he had fire in the belly, which many people with a greater comfort in their existence would not have had. But he was a self-made personality, a great personality, a person worthy of remembering as often as we can, particularly when it comes to the performing arts. Musiri Subramania Iyer was born on April 9th, 1899. And he was not from Musiri. He was from a village called Bomalapalayam, which is not very far from Musiri. And I always say, Bomalapalayam Subramania Iyer would have sounded terrible. Musiri Subramania Iyer just rolls off the tongue. And therefore it was a fortuitous transformation of names. We'll come to that as well. And he lost his mother when he was very young. He was one of 3 siblings. His sister also died when he was very young, and there was only his elder brother Kupuswami and himself. Shankara Sastri and Sitamal were the names of his parents. Musiri himself, we don't know. Musiri did not really share great many details about what he did in his childhood, where he went, what did he do. So those are all questions that we will probably never get an answer to. I think he took away all those stories with himself, and he was not a man who spoke volubly. In fact, today I'm sure he'll be wondering, so he was a man who kept his stories to himself. So we have no idea what he did for at least the first 15 or 16 years of his life. All we know is that he became very friendly with students of the St. Joseph's College in Trichy, and yet here again there is a question. There is a school of thought that says that he studied in Trichy formally. There is another school of thought that says he did not have a formal English education. But he became very close to people who were studying there. He picked up their English. He became very enamored by the language. He began to read, and slowly he acquired enormous felicity in the English language. It would be his first step in a life which would involve a lot of networking without the active networking that we kind of espouse today. People came to Musiri. He did not have to go out and seek them. And English certainly played a very important role in that. And later, when he wrote his letters, for instance, to people, he had a Dickensian way of expressing himself. So we can see where his influences as far as languages came. Apparently, it was at the age of 17 that Musiri was greatly influenced by S.G. Kittappa, who was then the great theatre hero of that time, the singing sensation of that era. So if he was born in 1899, we are already looking at 1916. By 1913, Ramanujayengar had begun to perform. By 1905, Sembe Vaidyanatha Iyer had begun to perform. Musiri had not even thought of a career in music in 1916. And he decided that he could sing like S.G. Kittappa. And he began to imitate that style. He became very successful at it. And F.G. Natesa Iyer, who was then the great impresario of Trichy, a senior railway official in the traffic department of the South Indian Railway, who was also a theatre personality, would later act with M.S. Subbulakshmi as her husband, Ishwara Sharma in the film Seva Sadanam. He was the man who noticed this young person and praised him and predicted a bright future for him if he took to music. And thereafter, Musiri formally began learning music from a Narayana Swami Iyer who was a government servant in Trichy. And that is at the age of 17, he began his formal training in music. And within a couple of years, he had migrated to Madras. So coming to Madras, he approaches a person called Karur Chinnaswamy Iyer. Here we have a photograph of Karur seated in the middle, Thanjavur Vaidyanatha Iyer in the black coat on this side, Musiri on that side. And Karur Chinnaswamy Iyer was a descendant of the famous Garbhapuri quartet, the Karur quartet. And later he would also become Sangeeta Kalanidhi in the Music Academy. He was a very well-known violinist. And it is Chinnaswamy Iyer whom Musiri approached initially in order to learn music. But he found that he did not have time because he was a very busy accompanist. And he decided to send Musiri to a man called T.S. Sabesa Iyer. Now, Sabesa Iyer is the reason why I have put this lineage, because Sabesa Iyer could trace his lineage all the way back to Thyagaraja. Remember that Thyagaraja had died only in 1847. When Musiri had begun his career, it was not even a century of Thyagaraja's passing. There were probably people who still knew of Thyagaraja's grandson, Thyagaraja's family. There were probably people who were still talking about various styles of performance that existed. Certainly people would have remembered Mahavaidyanatha Sivan. They would have heard him live. So that was very much an era in transition. And Thyagaraja, as we know, had several disciples, of whom the senior most was Mahar Nombu Chavadi Venkata Subbayar, who was his cousin. And Mahar Nombu Chavadi Venkata Subbayar had several disciples, of whom perhaps the most famous was Mahavaidyanatha Sivan. This is a personality that requires an entire storytelling by itself. He was the superstar, the first superstar whose life is recorded in great detail, right down to very, very personal details, is available in a matter of record. So it's almost like following Rajnikant in that era. People were curious to know what kind of a life Mahavaidyanatha Sivan was leading. He was that kind of a personality. He had a family member who was a manager, a watchdog. He was his visits were looked forward to in various courts. He was a great performer in Madras, various places. So he was a personality in his own right. And Sabesa Iyer had become his student at a very early age. And thereafter, he had become a great academic and a teacher. Sabesa Iyer was living in Porsavakkam in Madras, and Musiri seems to have come here and become his student. And it is from Sabesa Iyer that Musiri would acquire several nuances of his renditions. What we today attribute to be the Musiri style almost certainly came in entirety from Sabesa Iyer, with of course his individual stamp that he would leave behind on the art himself. Sabesa Iyer himself would become the Sangeeta Kalanidhi of the Music Academy, or at that time the president of the annual conference in 1934. And his father, Sambasiva Iyer, had taught Harikesanallur Muttaya Bhagavatar. There was enormous bad blood between Sabesa Iyer and Muttaya Bhagavatar. They detested each other most cordially. But afterwards they would work together in the Music Academy. Time and again the Music Academy has shown that people can work together though they may have personal differences. So the Musiri then moves to Nat Subrai Mudali Street in Mylapore, not very far from here. This is his, you can see Musiri Subramanya Iyer, and the letterhead is dated to sometime in the 1920s. Because in 1920, there are two versions to this story. One is that there was a performance in Karur to which he had been invited, and the billboards announced him as Musiri Subramanya Iyer. The other is that there was a performance in Madras, and it was in the advice of his guru that Bomalapalayam was given a decent burial and he became Musiri thereafter. But Semmangudi is the one who gave us the latter story, and because he knew Musiri very well, it's very likely that that may be the correct version of the story. But certainly by the early 1920s, we can make out that he had become Musiri Subramanya Iyer. And this is where, the career kind of branches out in multiple directions, which I will come to very quickly. So he was initially a performing artist. The voice of Musiri is very unique. There was perhaps in the era prior to artificial amplification, voices of that pitch. But certainly after amplification came in 1932 to Carnatic music, there is no male voice like Musiri's. It was high-pitched. Today when you hear it, it is almost feminine in its tonal quality. And he would become a recording sensation very, very quickly. This was the era of the gramophone records. This is really the golden era of the gramophone records. There were recording labels. There were 4 recording labels in Madras city. And they were all recording artists. These records were selling all over the place. And people were playing them at houses in various locations. The 3.5, 6-minute formats were extremely popular, easy on the ear, because you got a lot of variety, and that would in turn shape Carnatic music itself over a period of time. But let us listen to Musiri sing one composition and then go further.
ஒருக்கு மந்தார என் உள்ள துயரம் தீர்க்க என்றைக்கு சிவகிருபை வருமோ.
The gramophone records became so popular that Musiri was faced with a problem. His performance style on concert platform was a very slow and a nuanced style that he had inherited from Sabesayar. Certainly, even today, when you hear compositions like Sabapati Ki Veridevam or you hear Entavedu Kundu Raghava, the variations that Musiri brings in, the small, subtle, microtonal variations that he brings in the renditions of Sangatis, and the way he performs his Nerabal is almost dramatic. It would almost befit a theatre artist doing the same thing. That is the wealth of emotion that he brings into the composition. Now that required a lot of time. But the gramophone itself was restricted to the 3-minute format, or on two sides the 6-minute format. When he appeared on stage, people began to demand that he should sing like that. And that did pose a challenge to him. The other great challenge was songs like Endraiki Sivakripai, etc. are not meant to be sung on happy occasions, because Chandala Ulagam, Pondatiyam Verithu, etc., etc. are the words that follow. Apparently they would ask him to sing it in weddings and all that, and he was greatly embarrassed. He would tell them, no, this is not appropriate over here. I don't think you should be asking for it, but people would insist. So he became a gramophone sensation, which in turn began to feed his concert demands as well. And that is how he becomes a very busy concert artist and a recording artist. You can see in this photograph he is seated at what was then the corporation radio with the broadcasting mic, and he is recording for the radio at that point of time. Now Musiri, he himself, as I said, was not very forthcoming, but he wrote sometimes about his life, and there is a hilarious article that he has written about his experiences with the recording studios. And he says that the tyranny of the sound engineer was something that he found exceedingly difficult to handle, because this was the first generation, so to speak, that was actually recording, second if you ask me, because 1905 is when the first recordings really happened, but within 15 years they were all recording for it. And he says that the moment the light went on, we had to start singing. And so the sound engineer would be a very impatient man. He would keep, gesticulating and asking. So you had to be on the go when you came on to the recording studio. And secondly, you had to watch out for that 3-minute. So now, if that, out of nervousness, he says many of them would stop singing 2 minutes itself. Whereupon that man would keep saying, go ahead, don't stop. And he wouldn't have any idea that the song was over. So many of them had to perform an alapana at the end of the song, just to fill the gap between the... It is very interesting that people today, with very faulty understanding of what went on at that time, have begun to justify saying that Dhanammal has recorded an alapana after a song, therefore I can also do the same thing. Dhanammal did it because of a technical problem. That she was... we must also not forget that Dhanammal was near blind by that time. It would have required a lot of coordination between the sound engineer, somebody who was seated next to Dhanammal, so she must have stopped performing. And then, she must have had to extend the performance to complete it with. So that is not what was done, but it was done more out of a technical problem that had to be overcome. Musiri also, now that I bring Dhanammal into the story, I must also point out that Musiri went and learned from Dhanammal. So it was not just Sabes Iyer, it was not just Karur Sinasamy Iyer or that Narayan Swami Iyer. Dhanammal living then in Georgetown. So he and Parur Sundaram Iyer would go by cycle to learn from Dhanamma, and they would share the 50 paisa that they had to pay her as the tuition fees. And the legend goes that the first lesson was not successful, because Pahi Sri Giriraja Sute was what was going to be taught. And so Dhanammal began as Pahi Sri Giriraja Sute. Now Musiri, Pahi Sri Giriraja Sute. Apparently the blind eyes turned in his direction and said, Ayire, முதல்ல சாப்பாசா கத்துட்டு வந்துருங்க, அதுக்கப்புறமா நம்ம பாட்டெல்லாம் வச்சுக்கலாம். So that is how the lessons began with Dhanamma. Musiri, definitely that emotive style, the slow style that he, maybe that was also greatly influenced by the Veena Dhanamma tradition. Certainly he seems to have shown a lot of that influence. Very early on he seems to have acquired a set of students. I'll come to the students in a later slide. So you can see as a young man with students and disciples by his side. He was also a cartoonist's delight, as you can see Mali of Ananda Vigadan having portrayed him in the 1930s when he was very much a performing sensation. There are reviews of Musiri's concerts written by various critics of that era. They all speak of his emotional style of rendition, about his high-pitched voice, and about the various kinds of compositions that he is able to bring in. So he obviously had a large repertoire. So there is the base was always Thyagaraja because he came from the Thyagaraja school. But he seems to have also had some very rare Dikshita Kritis to his credit, also had Tamil songs to his credit. So there was something that he was providing for everybody in his music. This is again a sketch of Musiri in concert with Papa Venkatramaya, a young Palghat Mani Iyer, Morsing Sachidanandam Iyer and others. Kanjira player is, this is not Sachidanandam, it's someone else. But here we have this photograph, this sketch of Musiri performing. This is again by Mali in the Ananda Vigadan. Now in the 1930s, Musiri became quite a popular performer and he was attracting large crowds. Such was his popularity that it is said that in Chettinad, when he went to perform once, the audience found that the platform where he was seated was not high enough for them to be able to see him. So a group of men went and cut 4 palmyra trees, tempered them, cut them, sawed them and converted them into a platform of 4 feet height on which they placed Musiri and then asked him to perform. So that the rest all happened in the course of a day and so that he could perform. Similarly, can you imagine that he began in 1920, by the 1930s this was the level of his career, that on a certain occasion he had to perform and he cancelled his concert and Ramanujayengar had to stand in his place. And in that era, the village where this happened, nobody knew who was Ramanujayengar, who was Musiri. They had only heard all the songs. So they began to send request after request of Musiri to Ramanujayengar. But Ramanujayengar, being Ramanujayengar, sang all the songs. He knew every one of them. And he could keep the audience very happy. So this, I don't know what that man must have felt, that, they are asking about somebody who has come so much after me and they are asking me to sing all these. It reminds me very much of Thiruvahindrapuram, where we are told that a very senior performer in the 1990s went and performed, and then at the end of the day when the priest gave him all the prasadams and all that, and that was the time when Unni Krishnan got the national award. And this performer had been around in the field. He was one of the top ranking performers. Apparently the priest said, "Koodiya seekaram neengalum Unni Krishnan mari periya sthanathukku varanum na pennaadu vendikiren." So that kind of, I'm sure Ramanujayengar must have felt the same. But he became, it is very interesting that the Ramakrishna mission thought of using Musiri to raise funds for itself. So that was it gives you an idea of how ticket sales were going on in Carnatic music at that time. And Musiri was sent along with Madras Balakrishna Iyer, Tanjavur Vaidyanath Iyer and Palakkad Sachidanandam Iyer to Malaya as it was called at that time, in the 1930s, for a fundraising concert by C. Ramanujachari, who was then the secretary of the Ramakrishna mission. It's very interesting today that Saregama has put up Ramanujachari's photograph as Musiri Subramanya Iyer on YouTube. But certainly he was the man who got Musiri to go. This is a copy of Musiri. I didn't remember whether this was the passport or the driving license. This was the passport, but later photograph. But Musiri did travel to Malaysia, and here you can see him in Malaysia with several people. The tour was a great success. And Musiri writes an article about this as well, about how they went by ship all the way, how they went to Singapore, how they almost went into a naval base and got arrested, and then they had to come back and all that. Very interesting article. And we'll play a song before we go ahead.
தெயில தோட்டத்திலே ஆரத செய்கள் செல்வி செல்வி மாய் கொன்றாரம் அம்மா தெயில தோட்டத்திலே தெயில தோட்டத்திலே போயத நாள் முழுதும் போயத நாள் முழுதும் பல ஊழியம் செய்து உடம்பலுக்கு ஈழா நோயில் வருகிறாரே நோயில் வருகிறாரே அதை நோக்கியும் கெடுதாகுறாரம் அம்மா தெயில தோட்டத்திலே தெயில தோட்டத்திலே.
Teyilai Thotam, it is very interesting that he should have gone all the way to the Federated Malay States where there were estates, they were indentured labor. And this was a man who was singing songs about the plight of the indentured labor in estates, in tea estates, in rubber estates. So it's originally a Bharati composition which gets modified Karumbu Thotathile and then it becomes Teyilai Thotathile. And in that era, when Gandhi was talking about the plight of the bonded, indentured labor in various places, Musiri was singing songs that were of the same theme. And people were coming. See, he's got into celebrity endorsements. It's an advertisement for Kesavardhini hair oil, and considering that he was completely bald, he was he says very clearly that the women in my family have benefited from Kesavardhini hair oil. So he is not, saying that he uses them. So this was his status, that, he could give these things and, people were using it, celebrity endorsements. And of course, then, the film opportunity had to come. So R.K. Shanmugam Chetty's brother, Sir R.K. Shanmugam Chetty, who later would become the finance minister of independent India, also the husband of Bala Saraswati and the father of Lakshmi Shanmugam. He was at that time the Diwan of Cochin, and his family in Coimbatore had promoted what was called the Vasanta Mills. And Ramakrishna Chetty, who was Shanmugam Chetty's brother, got into films and was producing films at the Central Studios in Coimbatore in the 1930s. And Musiri was invited to play the role of Tukaram. They must have used an earlier Marathi film as the basis of recreating the whole thing in Tamil. And Musiri moves over to Coimbatore, and it is there that he realizes that film shooting is really not something, it's not a piece of cake, it's very difficult. So first of all, they put a fake mustache on him, and he develops a severe allergy to the paste that was being used, and his face was beginning to swell up. So they then gave him a break and said, you go back and grow your own mustache and come. And it took ages. Musiri was not able to grow a mustache of Tukaram's style. And later on he said, a watched for mustache never grows. This was a maxim of his. And finally he goes back to Coimbatore with a mustache. And that is when he gives a concert with a mustache, and the whole audience bursts out laughing because Papa Venkatramaya, who was always mustache, had shaved it off that day. Because I'm sure Papa did it only to trouble Musiri no end. Because Papa was like that. He was a very mischievous man. So he must have done it only because he knew that Musiri had grown a mustache. But the audience burst out laughing. It took some time to control them. And the director was a man called B.N. Rao, who knew no Tamil. And Musiri would act as interpreter because he was the only one who could understand English. So B.N. Rao would give all the directions to Musiri in English, and then Musiri would in turn explain to all the co-artists what needs to be done. But many people had told him that Coimbatore will not be conducive to your health because he was a man who was subject to lung trouble. And this would mark a very, very important setback in his life, which in turn would provide other opportunities for him. But when the film was shot and released, it was a moderate success. He never went back to the world of films, and much later, Randor Guy used to say that he had very choice epithets to use about people who acted in films. But Musiri developed pleurisy and was very ill for some time, after which he recovered and came back. But let's listen to my favorite from Tukaram. There are many songs, but there are, I think, 30 songs overall, but this is my favorite. So you can make out 6 sangatis where he has sung all the variants, whereas the chorus is singing it flat. It highlights what he is singing. I keep going back to this particular song. Now I must tell you also that Musiri had probably in his initial years, he had faced a lot of frustration before he made it big. There is even a story that at one stage he went away to Pune to join the defense accounts as a clerk, and then came back in order to take to his career. It is also very well known that by this time he was a householder in many ways, because his wife, he had married Nagalakshmi, but he and his wife had no children, but his brother Kupuswamy had passed away in Hyderabad, leaving behind a widow and 3 children, and he would bring them all to Madras, and thereafter they would become his family. Those 3 children that were his brother's children, he would bring them all up, he would ensure that they were all educated, well settled in life. And so when BC said that he gave, this was the first instance of giving, when he considered, he decided that his brother, they didn't have children, but they knew that their brother's children were theirs, and the brother's wife had come home, and they all formed a happy family together, and he took care of everybody. He was very much the pater familias of the family. This film, which Kalki Krishnamurti gave it a 2-star rating and said that Musiri was good at singing but not necessarily as an actor. But this film would get Musiri 30,000 rupees. He was also earning royalties of 3,000, 4,000 and all that. And that is how he purchases this property. And so on Oliver Road, very posh address. So he had moved to Porchavakam, he had moved to Nungambakam. Finally, he comes to Oliver Road in Mylapore. And it is said that one of the TVS family, I think, negotiated the purchase. I don't remember who did. Somebody, I have it written. K. Chandrasekharan. Correct. It was K. Chandrasekharan who negotiated the purchase of the property. And Musiri certainly was perhaps, I think, the first musician to own a property not in the temple side of Mylapore, but on the posh western side of Mylapore. And of course, Sabes Iyer was not very impressed. Sabes Iyer was brought here to be shown the house, and then he saw the long entrance passage, and it still exists. And he said, who lives in front? And Musiri said, there's a lawyer. I'll put it in English because it sounds more polished. Sabes Iyer said, only if that man breaks wind will you get any breeze. So that was, I will not explain it any further. But anyway, he had arrived by way of an address, and he was also getting very actively involved in the music academy. Right from 1927, when the Music Academy, the conference that established the Music Academy happened. Musiri was a performer even in that conference, and I think the family still has the medal that was given to Musiri on that occasion, 1927. And thereafter he would be very influential in the Music Academy right till his demise in 1975. But in 1939, I told you that there was almost 10 years of difference between Ramanuja Iyengar's debut and Musiri's debut. But 1 year after Ramanuja Iyengar, Musiri had been made the president of the annual music conference. So 1938, Ramanuja Iyengar, 1939, Musiri Subramania Iyer, and he still remains one of the youngest in the records of the Music Academy to have been made the president of the annual conference. So you can see this photograph taken in the University Senate House, which is where the conference happened that year. And Chembai, who was far senior to Musiri, was not considered for it. Chembai was quite understandably miffed. And Music Academy can do very strange things. So they told Chembai, you'll have to felicitate Musiri for being the president of the conference. So first of all, you deny the man, and then you say you come and felicitate this man. So Chembai arrives, and having come, he says, I am very glad that you have given Musiri the president's conference this year. I request that you should elect Musiri the president every year from here on. And thereafter, he stays away from the Music Academy for 5-6 years. And only then, after a lot of falling at his feet, it's only in 1950 that Chembai would eventually by then the Kalanidhi was well established and he would become the Kalanidhi himself. But that shows, how rapid Musiri's rise was in stardom. And his, in Sabesa Iyer's citation of 1934, it says that he is the guru of Musiri Subramania Iyer. So you can imagine that in 34, what was Musiri Subramania Iyer's status, that his guru is being recognized as the guru of this particular disciple. So Musiri, of course, as you can see, is here in this photograph with everybody else, and thereafter very much a pillar of the establishment. He would also become a pillar of the establishment as far as the Thyagaraja Aradhana was concerned. Musiri's entry into the Thyagaraja Aradhana was not a very happy one. So Sulamangalam Vaidyanatha Bhagavatar was then the secretary of what was called the Chinnakatchi. And when Musiri was very young, when he had just started performing, he had performed for the Thyagaraja Aradhana under the auspices of the Chinnakatchi. And Vaidyanatha Bhagavatar, in his characteristic style, had said, Neevenna Nadagathla poi nadicha innu nanna irukkum nenikiren. Musiri used to imitate S.G. Kittappa, as I said. So andha mari paatalla inge andha alavukku edupadadu, etc., etc., and in not very diplomatic terms had shunted Musiri away. So Musiri had stayed away from the Thyagaraja Aradhana for some time, but his guru was a pillar of the Chinnakatchi, therefore he also contributed to it. Finally, in 1940-41, so all these things are happening in rapid succession. 39, the president of the annual conference, 37, the film, then in 40-41, all the warring Katchis of the Thyagaraja Aradhana have united eventually. So there is the Periya Katchi, there is the Chinnakatchi, then there is the Bengaluru Nagaratnama Katchi. All the three Katchis have come together and they are performing a united Aradhana. Out of nowhere, Musiri suddenly gets catapulted to become the secretary of the Tyaga Brahma Mahotsava Sabha, which is the umbrella body which will take care of the organizing of the Thyagaraja Aradhana from then on. And assisting him is a person whose career also we need to now watch with great interest. Young Sinu from Semangudi. He is also there. Out of nowhere, he has also attached himself to the coattails of Musiri and he is riding. He is now also a very important man in the Thyagaraja Aradhana. So, Sulamangalam Vaidyanatha Bhagavatar has decided to stay away. Then it is Musiri who kind of convinces him that you should come back and you should be there for this united Aradhana. So he comes. Thereafter, he doesn't like what he sees for various reasons, and then he stays away from it for the rest of his life. But Musiri and Semangudi would remain very actively involved with the Thyagaraja Aradhana from then on, right till the 1960s. And Musiri would be secretary, he would be vice president, then eventually during the Thyagaraja 1967, which was Thyagaraja's birth bicentenary year, Musiri would once again become secretary of the Thyagaraja Aradhana. he would also be practically the guiding hand for several VIPs who would be the presidents of the Sabha. So you had Raja Sarannamalai Chettiar, you had Dr. P.V. Rajamannar and others. Musiri was always the guiding hand behind it. He also was the man who was acceptable to everybody, because though it was united in name, it was something like the NDA, UPA and all that sort of thing. There were various warring factions which wanted to sit out at various points of time. Musiri would always be the man who would go and make sure that everybody was together. Finally, he would be the person who would get G.K. Moopanar involved in the Thyagaraja Aradhana as well. Because when he was getting on in years and he realized that there were other political pressures that were likely to come, man with great foresight, he got Moopanar involved in the Thyagaraja Aradhana. And that is how later history would play itself out. Here you see him at the RR Sabha at that point of time for a fundraising event for the Thyagaraja 1940-41 Thyagaraja Aradhana event. And you have got Satyamurthy presiding over it and others by the side, and Musiri is reading out a speech for for the event for the Thyagaraja Aradhana itself. By now he had an enormous set of friends, and here you have got them all playing cards. Palghat Maniyar closest to the wall, Papa Venkatramaya with his trademark moustache, Tanjavur Vaidyanatha bare-bodied, Budalur Krishnamurthy Shastrigal, Musiri in a very animated moment throwing down a card, and Semangudi very watchful as always, observing what everybody else was doing, picking up a nuance or two. And this is certainly a photograph that repays a lot of, would repay attention, because Vaidyanatha and Musiri would be friends from the time that they went to Malaysia together. And afterwards, this house in particular was open to Vaidyanatha and is much, for many years, to his wife. Much after Vaidyanatha passed away, she would come here and she would be an honored guest of the family. So that was his way. You know, friendships were made for life. And friendships did not last only as long as a person was up above or, you know, in a position of influence. A friend was a friend was a friend. And that is how he created his network. He didn't actively create it. He created it by being himself. That's about it. And during this era, this would have been a particularly testing time when this particular card game was being played, because this was when the Tamil Isai movement was gaining ground. The Tamil Isai Sangam had been created in 1943. Musiri was a pillar of the Music Academy establishment. The feud had been brewing from 1939 itself. It would explode in 1940, and between 40 and 43, Music Academy and Indian Fine Arts Society on one side, Tamil Isai Sangam on the other. There were battles galore that were fought. Musicians were boycotting one institution and the other. Fans were boycotting one institution and the other. There were people predicting the demise of various organizations and sabhas. Even then, things haven't changed all that much when you look at it. It's just that they didn't have cell phones, so they were not taking fake photographs and putting it up saying, Sabha is empty. What is there to rejoice when a sabha is empty? I have no idea, but that is how it is. So this was what was happening at that point of time. And the press was taking sides as well. So Hindu on one side, and the Kalki on the other side. And you should see the kind of barbs that were being traded. There is an article which says the Musiri, the T.L. Venkatramaya, ivalna எந்த side support பண்றாளோ அது definitely successful இருக்காது. So அதனால it is a good thing that they are not supporting Tamil Isai. Therefore, the future of Tamil Isai is assured. This is one side of it. The other side of it is saying that what will happen to the compositions of the Trinity if we are now going to abandon them, jettison them completely and then go off in a tangent and promote all kinds of new compositions. It's very interesting that two men who made their name singing Tamil songs were not on the Tamil Isai Sangam side. Ariyakudi and Musiri. Both were on the side of the Music Academy because they were more worried from the musical side of it. They were saying that these are established compositions. Those are old compositions but without music, and therefore the music is modern. They were worried about that, but they would face a lot of calumny because of the stance that they were taking. And Kalki, of course, I think was at his finest writing levels at that point of time. So when Sir Mutta Venkat Subbarao becomes the chief guest of the Music Academy in the 40s, he begins his speech saying, "I am an ignoramus in the world of art." And Kalki in his review says, "Enna azhana vaarthai the ignoramus." Oru vaarthaila ennama sollitar. இது தமிழில் எழுதணும்னா அக்ஞான இருள் குன்று மௌலிகமலை மடசாம்பிராணி அப்படின்னு பல வார்த்தைகள் எழுத வேண்டியிருக்கும். இக்னோரமஸ்னு ஒரே வார்த்தையில் சொல்லி முடிச்சுட்டார். ஸோ பேசிக்கலி லார்ஸ், ஃபார் யோர் பெனிஃபிட், ignoramus is one word. In Tamil there is no one word for it. There are many words. So Kalki says that what a wonderful language English is. He has exposed his ignorance of music by using just one word when several would have been needed in Tamil. So those were the kind of attacks that were happening in the field. Musiri did not give any statements. He remained silent right through. And in 46, he would be invited by the Tamil Isai Sangam to perform. And when he goes there, he would include Thyagaraja Kritis as well in his bill of fare. But he sang Tamil songs, and his singing for the Tamil Isai Sangam really marks the breaking of the ice and the bonding between the various factions, and then the gradual, going back on very rigid stances, the thawing of relationships like the Indochina front, and thereafter on a more friendly footing from then on. Musiri eventually would be honored with the Isai Peraringiyar as well. As I said, he had enormous numbers of friends. So he included various industrialists, captains of industry, ICS officers, royalty. They all like stockbrokers. Everybody. Musiri himself tried his hand at shares and was a disaster at it. Lost his money and had to be bailed out by several friends at a very critical moment in his life. But they were all his friends. They would all come home. He would go and visit their houses. Certainly Subbalakshmi and Sadasivam, as was mentioned even in the introduction. So you can see K.R. Sundaramayyar over there from the Eason group. You can see Jupiter Ranganathan. T.S. Krishna is not here from TVS. You've got Semangudi. You've got the Ilayaraja of Travancore. You've got Chitra Narayanaswamy of Chitra and Company, the stockbroking firm. And then here you have got Ramnath Goenka seated next to Musiri, and they are all animatedly discussing something. And here you have at the Music Academy T.K.V and Sadasivam in conversation with Musiri seated on the other side, listening very avidly to whatever they were talking. So he also had his own social pastimes. So he used to like horse racing, because he considered it to be a gentleman's pursuit, a gentleman of society. So Musiri actually had a house in Gindi overlooking the grandstand. And he would entertain friends over there, and then they would all go and participate in the horse races. But he never gambled at it. He would play small bets because he knew his limits as a person. And the joke was that by the time Musiri had decided which horse to back, that race would be over. So he would deliberate so much on it. He also used to drive his own car and go around to all the places himself. So he was a man who knew how to drive. He was not calling the car as pleasure, which is what most musicians were calling it. A car was a car to him. And so he was a very polished man of society, and people liked to be with him. Much later, when Shruti magazine would do a retrospect on his life, they would say he brought dignity to the Carnatic music profession. Prior to that, while people appreciated the art, they very rarely liked to move with musicians as social equals. It was Musiri whom they actually went seeking, and they wanted to be his social equal, so to speak. And that is how he established a certain status in society, which others would then seek to follow over a period of time. Certainly the man who followed him at every stage of his life was Semangudi Srinivasa Iyer. Semangudi was virtually Musiri's shadow. What Musiri did, Semangudi did. Except for horse racing. That he didn't like, because that involved spending money. And that was not something that Semangudi was very comfortable with. And Papa Venkatramaya, the duo was very influential. They were pillars of the Music Academy. They were on the Sangeet Natak Academy board. The Alathur brothers detested them for the power that they wielded. Similarly, Papa keeps coming back, I don't know why. He called them Maha Periyava and Pudu Periyava after the Kanchipuram Acharyas, because he said that Maha Periyava, Pudu Periyava. So that was the kind of status that the two enjoyed as leaders in the world of music. And certainly Musiri was welcome at Kalki Gardens, which was then the high point of Madras society. Everybody wanted to be in Kalki Gardens. Everybody who came from Delhi wanted to go to Kalki Gardens. Kalki Gardens was where you needed to be seen. You had to have the coffee, you had to address the lady of the house as Kunjama and not as Subbalakshmi. And Musiri was her guru. He had certainly, MS's nuanced style of rendition itself would be greatly influenced by Musiri. The other man that you see over here is the chef du cabinet of the United Nations, C.V. Narasimhan. C.V. Narasimhan said, I always go around in life with Musiri's music in my heart and in my head. Musiri to him was God. And even before he went to New York, wherever he got transferred, he would carry the 78 RPM records of Musiri Subramania Iyer with him. And in 1939, when he came back to Madras, he became Musiri's disciple. And later, in 1940, he would be transferred to Dindigul. And when Madras was evacuated, without even a thought, Musiri and Mrs. Musiri went by car to Dindigul and stayed at C.V. Narasimhan's house. And there they began a sabha, just to keep Carnatic music alive, and then C.V. Narasimhan would come back. Wherever he went, he carried the records of Musiri with him. Whenever he came to Madras, he would learn songs from Musiri Subramania Iyer. And MS herself, Orangashayi and all that, you can see very clearly the stamp of Musiri when it comes to those compositions, the way she has rendered it. But here we will, I forget what song I have put, but let me see. I think it's the Mela Ragamalika. This composition which MS would make world famous was actually taught to her by Musiri. And Musiri was carrying the composition from Mahavaidyanath Iyer to Sabes Iyer to Musiri Subramania Iyer. And very often in the old days, people thought it was a work of Sabes Iyer. Sabes Iyer or Mela Ragamalika was what everybody said. People had forgotten Mahavaidyanath Sivan. And Musiri is the one who would teach MS Subbalakshmi this composition. Similarly, Sri Vishwanatham Bhajeham, the Chaturdasha Ragamalika, it was he who really began performing it and made it very popular. We owe a lot to him. Now, by 1945, the best years of Musiri were over as far as a performing artist was concerned. But then, a great opportunity came by way of teaching, because in 1947-48, the government of India established what was called the Central College of Carnatic Music, which is today called the RSC Isai Kalluri, which is in Brody Castle in Adyar. And Musiri would be made the first principal. So here you see him at the entrance to what was called Bridge House at that time with Rajaji, then the Governor General, and Brinda, who also joined the faculty. Musiri would bring a certain stamp to the functioning of that college, something that I would say has not really been repeated in many years to follow. Several international visitors and national visitors would gravitate to this Central College at that time. So when they came, they had to come to the college. You can see Yehudi Menuhin being welcomed over there by MS Subbalakshmi at the entrance to the college itself. Then you can see over here a performance by Musiri with Karekuli Muthu Iyer on the Mridangam. Ramanuja Iyengar having come to give a lecture or performance maybe. Here you've got B.V. Keskar, then the Minister for Information and Broadcasting. You see here the Veena of Muthuswami Dikshitar being brought to the college for a formal puja. and the faculty of the college itself at that time, the men, Karekudi Muthu Iyer, Tirupamburam Saminatha Pillai, Devakotai Narayana Iyengar, Kalyana Krishna Bhagavatar, Varahur Muthuswami Iyer, so many of them. They were all... Is that you, Girija? The girl on the... Oh! So the students, in my view, got an exposure that they would have rarely got otherwise, because they were being now exposed to people from all over the world, great scholars, great musicians coming. So he expanded their horizon in a very big way. Of course, Musiri, being Musiri, had his own quirks. So there is this famous story of him very painstakingly teaching the students a particular composition, and they repeating the same mistake unerringly at the same place, but him going on and on and on, and a visitor came and he was watching it. Next day he asked Musiri, have they finally learnt it? Musiri said, no, I have learned to sing the way they have. So with that I am done. And similarly, there was a musicologist who came and who gave a never-ending speech. And finally, Musiri was asked to give a vote of thanks. So, you know the famous one, Nallar Oruvar Ularel Avar Poruttu Peyyana Peyyum Mazhai. He said, Nallar Oruvar Ularel, and he sat down. That is, if a good man blabbers. And with that, he did not speak thereafter. So, these were the kind of things that he was capable of. He could be deadly in his wit when he wanted to be. Musiri was given 2 extensions, and finally in 1965, I think he retired from the College of Carnatic Music as the principal. But prior to that, his Sashtiyapta Bhurti was celebrated in 1959 in a grand manner with Semangudi. Who else could have sung the concert? All the great social birds of Madras arriving and departing to take his blessings. And thereafter, Musiri would lead a happy life of retirement. Here you can see him playing cards by himself in this house, in that house, and the occasional concert as well. Of course, this must have been before, because Chowdeya had died by 1967. So this must have been sometime in that era. Here he is with T.K. Govindarao, accompanying him, Thiruvalangadu Sundaresa Iyer on the violin. And then Musiri's turn to get national awards. Here he is on his way to Delhi, being seen off by all family and friends. In those days, that was the kind of thing you did when people went by flight. So here he is going off to Delhi in order to receive the President's Award, receiving it from Dr. Zakir Hussain. I don't think he was interviewed when he made his first flight, but we know Vishwanath Iyer was interviewed when he went on his first flight to Sri Lanka. And they asked him, is this your first flight? He said, this is my last flight. I don't intend to ever get back onto this particular craft. So, Musiri's recordings are, of course, available in plenty for people to hear. There are performances at the Perambur Sangeeta Sabha where this particular photograph was taken. Here he is in Sri Lanka with a young Premila Gurumurthy. Premila Gurumurthy, at that time, a young performer in Colombo. He was the one who would encourage her parents to move to Madras so that she could invest further time and be exposed to greater quantities of values in Carnatic music. And that would start off a career on its own, which would culminate in her becoming Vice Chancellor of the Music University. If Musiri had not laid the seeds for that, her parents would not have chosen to make that shift. Here he is teaching. There is Rukmini Ramani, Padma Narayan Swami, Mani Krishna Swami, and Suguna Purushottaman. Of course, we have Sangeeta Kala Acharya, Srimati Suguna Varadachari right here. I didn't know that. Where is the hand now that you...
The last hand.
So, apparently, he was very protective of his girl students. And he would drop them home if it was late. And very often he would sit outside the Sabha to listen to his disciples performing, so that they would not be nervous by his presence, and later on he would give them valued but very nuanced feedback. Never a person with ill will towards anybody. Certainly there were a number of disciples. My memory is no longer what it was, and so I am going to resort to reading it out, which I am overcome with shame. 20 years ago I would have mugged up all these names at a glance, but that ship has already sailed, as my son would say. So there was N.G. Sitaraman, his earliest vocal support, who later became a faculty of the Swati Tirunal College. Others were S.D. Vishwanathan, Lalita Bhanu, sister of Sangeeta Kalanidhi T.K. Murthy, Sangeeta Kalanidhi T.K. Govindarao, K.S. Venkatraman, Puranam Purushottama Shastri, C.V. Narasimhan, Padma Narayan Swami, Rukmini Ramani, Suguna Purushottaman, Sangeeta Kala Acharya, Suguna Varadachari, Sangeeta Kalanidhi, the Bombay sisters, Sangeeta Kalanidhi, Mani Krishna Swami. Certainly the list is very long. And if you include M.S. Subbalakshmi, so that is one more feather in his cap. Musiri would age gracefully. Here you see him in the last few years of his life. And then finally in 1975, following a brief illness, he would pass away in the house that he had earned and he had built, and in which he had lived for very happily for the rest of his life. Musiri's life, in my view, has a lot of lessons, particularly for the 21st century, when we believe that networking is something that we have to cheapen ourselves in order to do. Networking pannama enna panna mudiyum. I think he didn't consciously set out to network. He did it unconsciously, as I keep saying, with great dignity. I keep going back to Kamba Ramayanam or in Valmiki Ramayanam. In both places, Sita Devi, when she is at the lowest point in her life, when Hanuman comes with the Kanayari and he is giving it to her, nowhere does it say that she received it like this. It only says Grihitva. She picked it up from Hanuman's hand. She knew what her status was, what her strength was. I think Musiri always operated from a status of strength. He was a great musician. And he didn't need to abase himself or lower himself to seek anything. All that bounty came because he invested in his core competence, which was his art. And he presented it beautifully. He never shot his mouth off unnecessarily. He lived life as an exemplar. And when he did that, people automatically gravitated towards him and elevated him into a very high status. To me, Musiri's life is that. Apart from the great art that he produced, that after so many years, I still don't believe that anybody else can sing Pahimam Ratnachala Nayaka like the way he sang. The way he could sing Nagumomu. Nobody else could have sung Nagumomu the way he sang it. And when an obituary can begin as Gagana, because Gagana Nipai, that particular line, he would bring so much of effort and energy into creating that whole atmosphere which Thyagaraja had created in Nagumomu. He made that song his own. He made several songs like Tiruvadi Charanam his own. I'm not playing many of that over here because I think playing 1 second or 30 seconds of it is a travesty to that style. You need to go and listen to it on YouTube. You have to watch. You can't watch, there are only photographs, but you can listen to how much detailing he brings into ragas, into compositions, and how he creates a world of music that seems to be passing us by very, very quickly. Fortunately, we have YouTube to recreate that. I thank you all once again for having been here. I thank Mr. and Mrs. Thyagarajan for having invited me to come to this house and to present the life of Musiri. Pura Lava Kushabhyam, when Lava and Kusha went to Rama and told the Ramayana. So like that I feel, what is it that I have done? I have only come back and held a mirror to this house and all the memories that it holds. Thank you very much.
Arguably, actually, one living person who really has the maximum detail about Musiri is my brother-in-law Thyagu, right? And every time we listen to Sriram, because he connects so many facts of so many other people, we get to learn more about Musiri also from him, right? It's really, really amazing. Thank you so much. I also want to acknowledge that the initial prayer song was sung by the great-granddaughter Anusha Thyagaraja, and also Ishani, the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
நீங்க வந்து போட்டா பெட்டரா. நான் உடைச்சுட்டேன்னா அப்புறம் நீ வந்தா உடைச்சிட்டு போயிட்டான்.
No, you got to turn the key on the left. And then one more thing, I don't know, I'm sure you must be knowing about it. YouTubeல ஒரு தடவை பார்த்துட்டு ஒரு எம்ஜிஆர் சினிமா அந்த டைட்டில்ல தேயிலை தோட்டத்திலே ஓடிட்டு இருக்கு. I said something must have gone wrong, ஏதோ மிக்ஸ் பண்ணி
சதி லீலாவதி.
ஆமா அப்படின்னு நினைச்சேன். அப்புறம் கொஞ்சம் படிச்சா அது எம்கே ராதா ஆக்ட் பண்ண படம்னு நினைக்கிறேன். He talks about his travels along the கதை.
Correct. Story is about that.
அது இதுல போய் ஏதோ கட்டப்பட்டிருக்காரு போட்டு அதனால யூஸ் பண்ணி ஆச்சரியமா இருந்தது. That is running through the titles, the bottom.
Anyway, thank you so much for everybody. இந்த பாட்டு வந்து பெரம்பூர் சங்கீத சபால 40 மினிட்ஸ்க்கு போகும். Okay. ஆமா. So that's the difference of the gramophone and all so beautifully talked about by Sriram. Thanks Sriram once again.
தமிழ் சாங்ஸ்ல இவ்வளவு இன்ட்ரெஸ்ட் எப்படி வந்தீங்க?
அந்த ஏரியா நல்லா இருக்கலாம். புதுசு